Meeting in Nairobi these days is a very exciting thing, not only because of events that His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta referred to that just a few weeks ago took place here in Nairobi when Habitat's sister organization, the United Nations Environment Programme, had its Governing Council and essentially moved forward on the implementation of many of the decisions that heads of state and government had taken in Rio, indeed with remarkable pace. Our presence here in the Governing Council of UNHABITAT is also an expression of a partnership that has evolved literally over decades. Evolved because of the decision by Kenya to invite the United Nations to first establish the United Nations Environment Programme here, then to also host the world headquarters of UNHABITAT, to also evolve over time the United Nations of Nairobi office, and therefore create the fourth headquarter duty station of the United Nations in the world. And indeed it is still the only one in the developing world. But these are, in a sense, phenomena of presence. What has been meaningful and significant is that the history of UNHABITAT and of the United Nations Environment Programme have been inextricably linked over their period of existence. And this is not just a matter of coincidence and location. The question of urbanization, of an increasing number of people leaving what were traditionally rural economies, migrating to the city in hope, in despair, in search of new opportunities, has over the last few decades been time and again a central theme also of the United Nations and the development discourse. The theme for this year's Governing Council, Time to Think Urban, clearly reflects the fact that over these decades something phenomenal has taken place. The majority of the world's population does live in cities today. And I think when we look at the question of sustainable development, urbanization, environment, but also the things that Amina just highlighted, jobs, employment, opportunity, and going back to President Kenyatta's priorities also in terms of his new government, of how to address these challenges that are, in a sense, centered around the urban areas of nations across the world today. Where is development, where is opportunity going to come from? Where are the resources going to come from? And how are we also going to deal with the fact that as the world urbanizes, it is not only a story of success, as Jean-Claude, I'm sure, will later on in his policy statement outline again, very often the history of urbanization has been one of chaos, of lack of planning, of not strategic development, but rather ad hoc development, often allowing cities to evolve in a way that if you could go back to the drawing board 100, 300, 500 years ago and start again, you know you would have done it very differently. Our work together as UNHABITAT and UNEP is centered around the notion of how urbanization can be both an opportunity for people, a driver for development, and increasingly also a significant catalyst for rethinking the way urbanization will happen in the future. The fact of the matter is that as people move to the cities, yes, they concentrate in terms of where they live, we concentrate services. We are able to, as Amina just mentioned, to see also urbanization as a driver for countries to become middle-income nations. But the price very often for urbanization is also one that, particularly on the environmental front and in the slums, shows that equity and sustainability are not automatically resolved by urbanization. And it is at this nexus that our work as Habitat in UNEP has time and again over the years focused. And just the recent emphasis that the Secretary General has brought to the whole UN system again that my colleague Jean-Claude mentioned this morning, the Millennium Development Goals, less than 1,000 days to go to meet what were yes, challenging and ambitious, but in a sense very straightforward set of goals, is still under threat of not being met by 2015. UNEP and UNHABITAT have worked together on one aspect of this which is central also to MDG 7, sanitation, one of the targets identified in the MDG 7 context. When you look at the target of sanitation in its own right, then maybe the provision of sanitation services of toilets may be the answer that one is looking for in statistical terms. But when we work together as Habitat and UNEP, we realize that for sanitation, you are not only looking at the point of defecation, if I may use for a moment this very graphic expression. You're looking at the fact that you need to provide water resources that need to come from somewhere. That as people in cities use water and then make water no longer a directly usable natural resource, you are dealing not only with sanitation, but also with what you will do with sewage treatment. Water comes from somewhere, and that somewhere is not an endlessly producing resource. Humans use it through the cities and urban spaces, and then water goes somewhere. And in this city here, we have an extraordinary example, Governor, the Nairobi River. A river that begins just 13 or 15 kilometers outside the city, and by the time it leaves the city on the other side, a few years ago, had literally become a poisonous stream. The cleanup of the Nairobi River, with setbacks, yes, but in essence, we're turning around an artery that connects one side of the city with the other side of the city, is an example of how also in the urban spaces we need to begin to look at who is polluting, what are the sources, and who bears the cost for that pollution. Because the pollution that comes from small businesses, from estates that do not treat their sewage and go straight in the river, becomes the drinking water, the water with which people in the slums then wash themselves and have to survive. And this is the story of environment and urbanization. We are dealing with the question of resources, of sustainability, of how we can design cities, not simply with singular objectives, but in the broader context of sustainable development. Cities are meant to be spaces in which people thrive, in which young people have hope, in which women and men have opportunity, in which jobs, services, infrastructure are an integral part of the promise of development. But when you look at it from the environmental sustainability point of view, we are also looking at cities as a major opportunity to address global challenges, such as climate change, energy efficiency, building efficiency, carbon emissions, the efficiency with which cities also use resources that come from somewhere, sometimes in the hinterland of cities, sometimes from other parts of the country, sometimes from across the world, are part of the footprint of cities that will either assist us or hinder us in moving towards what we in UNEP and also the Rio Summit have threaded through a discussion on the transition towards a green economy. How can 7 and soon 9 billion people be able to thrive in cities and yet recognize that we operate within planetary boundaries, if you want to use that expression, or simply within the laws of gravity of there is only so much on the planet and we must become more resource efficient. We have a side event together this week here for your benefit, in which Juan and I and our colleagues from the International Resources Panel and also Italy will talk about decoupling. What are some of the solutions that have been developed and have been scaled up in the cities around the world? How can we make economic progress in the provision of services for an ever larger and wealthier and affluent number of people on the planet, not simply be a formula where we continue to increase resources and pollute on the same formula as we have done for the last 100 or 200 years. Decoupling, resource efficiency, the ability to look at the building infrastructure of a city as something that has enormous potential for decoupling, for instance, the emission of carbon dioxide. These are examples in which I hope our partnership between UNHABITAT and UNEP will be a central part of feeding into the post-2015 development agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and an understanding that the future of sustainable development is not premised on trying to look at the urban and the rural space, the economic, the social and the environmental, as somehow in competition with one another. The future of sustainable development, and in a sense the answer to development challenges of the 21st century, lies in what Rio and the future we want accentuated. That economic, social and environmental progress, be it in the city of the future or in the village of the future, as President Kenyatta cited, is going to be premised about being able to address these three challenges as one. It is then that development for today's generation will allow us to also think about the cities of the 22nd century as places with opportunity. With these remarks, I wish you a very successful Governing Council session and commit, as my predecessors and Juans have done, to continued partnership between UNEP and UNHABITAT for the Sustainable Development Agenda of the peoples of the world and the United Nations. Thank you.